"You don't belong at this family dinner, Marissa. You never have." Eleanor said it while passing the green beans, like it was a serving suggestion instead of a knife. Nobody at the table looked up right away. My husband Grant kept his eyes on his plate. His brother Dean smirked into his wine glass. The kids, my kids, though nobody at that table would have said it that way, sat frozen between us like they were used to this, because they were. "I've been coming to these dinners for 6 years, Eleanor," I said. "Coming isn't belonging." She smiled the way she always smiled when she'd landed a hit and wanted credit for the delivery. "You're the second wife, dear. Diana was family. You're just here." Diana, Grant's first wife, dead now 4 years, a car accident on 94 in the rain, gone before 11-year-old Wyatt or 9-year-old Casey ever really got to know her as anything but a photograph on the hallway wall. I'd married Grant 2 years after that, moved into a house that still had her handwriting on the recipe cards in the kitchen drawer, and spent every day since being introduced, gently and pointedly, as the kids' stepmom. Never, not once, as their mother, not by this family. I looked at Wyatt. He was pushing peas around his plate, 13 now, old enough to hear exactly what his grandmother meant, and young enough to still not know what to do with it. Casey, 9, had gone very still, the way she always did when the table got tense, like stillness could make her invisible until the danger passed. "Eleanor," I said, "I have a hearing on Thursday." "A hearing." She said it like I'd announced a hair appointment. Dean chuckled and reached for the wine bottle again. "At the county courthouse, family court." Grant's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He hadn't known the exact date. That was the thing nobody at that table understood yet. Not even my husband. Not fully. "What kind of hearing?" Dean asked, more curious than kind, the way he asked most things, like the answer might give him something to use later. I looked at Wyatt and Casey, who were both watching me now, and I said the only thing I'd come to that dinner planning to say, the kind where a judge signs the papers that make it official, that I'm their mother, not their stepmother. Their mother, under the law, permanently, the same as if I'd given birth to them. The table went very quiet. Eleanor's fork stopped over the green beans. For the first time in 6 years, I watched her not have an immediate response ready. "That's not your decision to make alone," she said finally, recovering. "There's a father in this family too, and a grandmother, and an entire history that started before you ever walked into this house." "It's not alone," I said. "Grant signed his consent 8 months ago." Every head at the table turned toward Grant. He set his fork down slowly. "I did," he said. It was the first time he'd spoken since Eleanor's opening line, and his voice, when it finally came, was steadier than I expected. "I signed it because it's true, Mom. She is their mother. She has been for years. This just makes the law agree with what already happened in this house every single day." Eleanor looked at her son like he'd struck her. Dean, for once, didn't say anything at all. "My name is Marissa Cole. I met Grant 3 years after Diana died, at a grief support meeting I was leading for parents who'd lost a spouse, not because I'd lost one myself, but because I'd spent a decade as a licensed family therapist, specializing in exactly that kind of loss, childhood bereavement in particular, the long tale of what happens to a kid's sense of safety when a parent simply doesn't come home one day. I watched Grant for 4 months across a circle of folding chairs in a community center basement before he ever asked me to coffee, and even then, it was months more before I met Wyatt and Casey, because Grant was careful, protective, in a way I respected, even when it was slow. He told me about Diana in pieces, the way people tell you about grief when they're still inside it, how she'd been driving home from a work dinner in the rain, how Wyatt, 7 at the time, had asked for 2 years afterward whether the rain was what killed her, as though there was a mechanism he could understand and therefore control. How Casey, only 5, barely remembered her mother's voice anymore, and cried about that more than she cried about the loss itself, because you can't grieve what you can't fully recall. You can only grieve the absence of the memory. What I understood, professionally and personally, in a way his own family never seemed to grasp, was that those two children had lost their mother once already, permanently, without warning, and that the last thing on earth they needed was another adult who might disappear from their lives on a technicality. I was never going to be Diana. I never wanted to replace her. I kept her recipe cards in that kitchen drawer for a reason, kept her photograph on the hallway wall, made sure Wyatt and Casey knew they could talk about her with me any time, that missing her didn't hurt my feelings. But somewhere in those first 2 years of pancake breakfasts and homework help, and 2 a.m. fevers and a school play, where Casey forgot her one line and looked straight at me in the audience for reassurance instead of anyone else, something had happened that had nothing to do with replacement and everything to do with two kids who needed someone showing up every day, without fail, and choosing to keep showing up. Eleanor never saw it that way. To her, I was an interloper who'd wandered into her dead daughter-in-law's life and started wearing her furniture. She said it in smaller ways for years before that dinner. The kids' caretaker, never their mother. Careful never to introduce me as family at church, at school events, at the holidays that mattered most. At Wyatt's 10th birthday party, she'd told a neighbor, within my hearing, that she was helping Grant find good childcare since the accident, as though I were a hired service rather than a wife. At Casey's first communion, she'd sat in the front pew beside Grant and left me standing in the back with the aunts and cousins she considered peripheral. Grant noticed some of it. He noticed less than he should have. He loved his mother, and he loved a version of peace that meant not making her uncomfortable, even when her comfort came at my expense, and increasingly, at the kids' expense too. I understood that grief does strange things to families. It had certainly done strange things to mine, growing up, watching my own parents' marriage fracture under the weight of my younger brother's illness. But understanding it and living inside it for 6 years were two very different things. I remember the specific afternoon it first crystallized for me, how deep it ran. Casey's first communion, spring of our 3rd year together. I'd spent 2 weeks helping her practice the responses, sewn a small repair into the hem of the white dress Diana's sister had passed down, driven her to every rehearsal. At the church afterward, there was a small reception in the parish hall, cake and lemonade and folding chairs arranged around the room. Eleanor arrived with a gift bag and steered straight past me to Grant's side, and when the parish photographer asked to get a photo of the family, she physically angled herself and Grant and the kids toward the camera in a way that left me standing half a step outside the frame. I remember the photographer, a kind older man, pausing and saying, "Ma'am, are you in this one?" And Eleanor answering, before I could, "No, she's not immediate family," with the same pleasant, unbothered tone she used for everything cruel. I stood outside that photograph for 4 more years before I decided I was done standing outside anything again. I had a friend, Renata Ibarra, a family law paralegal I'd worked alongside for years on custody evaluations through my therapy practice, who I called the week after Casey asked me the question that changed everything. Renata had seen dozens of blended families come through the system, some healthy, most complicated, and she'd always told me, half joking, that she could usually tell within the first 10 minutes of a consultation which step-parents actually meant it and which ones were performing family for an audience. If you and Dad got divorced, would I still get to see you? 8 years old, tucked into bed, asking it in the particular flat voice kids use when they've been turning something over in their mind for longer than you realize. I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before I answered. "I don't know, sweetheart. Legally, I might not have a right to." She cried. Not because she thought Grant and I were getting divorced. Nothing was wrong between us, but because some part of an 8-year-old's brain had done the math that no adult in that house had bothered to do out loud. That under the law, I was nothing to her. A stepmother with no automatic rights if anything ever happened to Grant. No say in medical decisions if I wasn't specifically listed on a form. No legal tie at all if the worst happened, No matter how many years I'd spent being the one who knew her allergy list, her nightmares, the exact way she liked her toast cut, the stuffed rabbit she still needed to fall asleep, even though she'd never admit that to her friends. I called Renata the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, sitting in my car in the school drop-off line. "Walk me through step-parent adoption," I said. "All of it. What it takes, how long, what could go wrong." She was honest with me from the start. "It's slow, it's invasive. Background checks, a home study, interviews with a caseworker who's going to ask you things that feel personal, because they are. And you need consent. From Grant, since he's the biological father with full custody. And typically, if the other biological parent is deceased and there's no surviving parental rights to terminate, it's more straightforward than a lot of cases. But more straightforward in family court still means months, sometimes over a year. And Marissa, I have to ask, are you doing this because you're scared or because you're sure? Because the process will find out which one it actually is, eventually, and so will the kids. Both, I admitted. I'm scared of losing them on a technicality, and I've never been more sure of anything in my life. "Then start today," she said. "I'll help however I can, on my own time. This isn't billable. This is just, I've watched you with those two for 3 years now. I know what this is." I started the process quietly, 4 months after Casey's question. I filed the petition with Renata's help, navigating the paperwork on the side of her actual job, staying late some evenings in her cramped office 2 blocks from the courthouse, walking me through forms most people never see unless they're already inside the system. I sat through the background checks, fingerprints, a criminal history search that came back clean, the way I knew it would, but that still made my hands shake handing over the ink card, as though some clerical error might surface and take this from me before it had even begun. I did the home study, which meant a caseworker named Deb Halloran walking through our house room by room over 3 separate visits, checking smoke detectors, opening the medicine cabinet, asking about discipline philosophy, sitting with Wyatt and Casey individually in the living room while I waited in the kitchen, straining not to listen through the wall. On her second visit, Deb asked me, gently, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, why I wanted this. "Because I already am their mother," I told her. "Diana's recipe card's 2 feet away in the drawer between us. I just want the law to catch up to what's already true. I want there to be no gap, no technicality, nothing that could ever take me out of their lives if something happened to Grant. I want them to never again lie awake wondering if I'd still be theirs." Deb wrote something in her folder and didn't say much in the moment. The professional neutrality of someone who's learned not to tip her hand mid-evaluation. But on her third and final visit, as she was packing up her bag at the door, she paused and said, almost off the record, "In 11 years doing this job, Miss Cole, I don't get many cases this clean. Most of the time, there's something complicated underneath. Resentment, a parent who isn't fully on board, kids who are performing enthusiasm they don't feel. This isn't that. I just wanted you to know that before the report goes in." I didn't cry in front of her. I waited until her car pulled out of the driveway. There was one moment, about 2 months before the hearing, when I genuinely thought the whole thing might collapse. Somehow, I still don't know exactly how, whether Dean let something slip, or whether Eleanor had simply pieced it together from overhearing a phone call. She found out the process was underway before we were ready to tell her. She didn't call me. She called the County Family Services office directly, identifying herself as the children's grandmother, and asked pointed questions about concerns regarding the suitability of the petitioner, a phrase she must have looked up specifically for the call. Deb told me about it afterward, required by protocol to note any outside contact in the file. She didn't allege anything specific, Deb said carefully. It read like someone trying to slow things down without being able to say why. It won't affect the report. I wanted you to know it happened, though, in case it comes up. I confronted Grant that night, shaking, half convinced 11 months of careful work was about to unravel, because of a phone call I couldn't undo. Your mother called the caseworker, I said. She tried to get them to flag me as unsuitable. Grant went very still. I'll talk to her, he said. Talking hasn't worked in 6 years, Grant. Then I'll stop talking and start telling her how it's going to be, he said. And for the first time since I'd known him, I believed he meant it. He drove to her house that same night. I don't know everything that was said, and he's never told me the whole conversation, but he came home 2 hours later and said only, "She won't do that again," and he was right. She didn't. Whatever line he drew that night, she never crossed it a second time, and something in the balance of that family shifted permanently in that one conversation, even though I wasn't in the room for it. Grant found out about the filing 8 months in, when Deb Halloran called the house for a follow-up, and he happened to be the one who answered the phone instead of me. I remember his face when I got home that evening from a client session. Not angry, just stunned, the particular stillness of a man realizing his wife has been carrying something enormous without telling him. "You should have told me," he said, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on. "I know," I said. "I was scared it wouldn't happen, and I didn't want your mother finding out before it did, because I know exactly what she'd say, and I didn't want that voice in my head while I was already fighting my own doubts about whether I even deserved this." He didn't argue with that. He knew his mother too well to pretend I was wrong. He signed his own consent within the week. As the biological father, his approval was legally required, and he gave it without hesitation once he understood what I'd been quietly building, which told me something important about where his heart actually was, even when his spine had been slower to catch up in front of his family. What he asked, quietly, sitting across the kitchen table that night, was whether we could wait to tell everyone until it was finalized. "Not because I'm ashamed," he said, "because I know my mother. If she gets wind of this while it's still pending, she will find a way to make it harder than it needs to be. I've watched her do it before, to other things that mattered to me. I don't want to find out how far she'd go with this one." I agreed. We told no one. Not Dean, not Eleanor, not even my own sister until the filing was nearly through. For 8 more months, I sat across from this family at dinners and holidays, absorbing every stepmom and every "you're just here," knowing the entire time that a caseworker's report was quietly working its way toward a judge's desk, that Wyatt and Casey had already been interviewed separately and had both, independently, told Deb Halloran without hesitation that yes, they wanted this. Yes, Marissa was already their mom in every way that mattered to them. The hearing was scheduled for the Thursday after that particular dinner, the one where Eleanor said I didn't belong. I hadn't planned to announce it at the table. I'd meant to keep it quiet until after, the way we'd planned. But there is only so long a person can sit at a table being erased in front of her own children before something in her decides not to anymore. Eleanor's line about Diana being real family and me being just here landed on something in me that had been building for 6 years, and it came out before I could stop it. Eleanor called the house the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. She called again that afternoon, twice. By evening, she showed up at our front door, which she had never once done unannounced in 6 years of marriage. "You cannot do this," she said, standing in my kitchen, in my house, the one that still had Diana's recipe cards in the drawer and my adoption paperwork stacked neatly on the counter where I'd left it that morning. "Those children have a mother. She's gone, but she was real, and you don't get to erase her by putting your name on legal paper." "I'm not erasing Diana," I said, keeping my voice level even though my hands were shaking behind my back. "I talk about her with them every single week. There are pictures of her in both their rooms. I make sure they know it's safe to miss her around me. I have never once tried to make them forget her, Eleanor, and you know that because you've watched me do it for 6 years. Then why do this? Because if something happens to Grant, I have no legal standing to keep them, and they would go into a system with strangers deciding what happens to them, instead of staying with the only mother either of them can actually remember day to day. Because when Wyatt broke his arm last spring, I had to call Grant at a work conference in another state to get consent for a routine x-ray, because my signature on that hospital form meant nothing under the law. Because Casey asked me, at 8 years old, lying in her bed, whether she'd lose me if something happened to her father, and I couldn't tell her no, because legally, at that moment, that was true. I looked at her, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't soften it. I'm not trying to erase their mother. I'm trying to become one, permanently, in every way that will actually protect them. Because apparently, nobody else in this family thought to ask what happens to those kids, if the worst happens, and I'm still just a stepmother with no rights. She didn't have an answer for that. Her mouth opened and closed once. It's not that simple, she finally said, which is what people say when the simple version makes them look bad. It is that simple, I said. You just don't like the answer. She left without saying goodbye, and I didn't chase her down the driveway to smooth it over the way I'd spent 6 years doing, because I was done doing that at my own expense, and at Wyatt and Casey's. Thursday came fast. Family court in our county sat in a modest brick building downtown, nothing like the marble courtrooms on television, fluorescent lights, water-stained ceiling tiles, a bailiff who knew half the regulars by first name, a waiting room with plastic chairs, and a coffee machine that had been broken since at least the previous winter. Grant sat beside me. Wyatt and Casey sat on the other side, both of them dressed nicer than they needed to be, because I'd told them this was important and they'd decided, on their own, without either of us prompting them, that it deserved their good clothes. Wyatt had even asked Grant to help him with a tie, which he hadn't worn since a cousin's wedding 2 years earlier. I hadn't told Eleanor the time. I found out later that Dean had, quietly, the way people do things when they want to watch a fire without lighting the match themselves. And she came anyway, slipping into the back row of the small courtroom, just as the judge was reviewing the file, a folder thick with 11 months of paperwork, condensed into something a stranger in a robe would review in under an hour. Judge Patricia Aldwin had handled more step-parent adoptions than she could count, and she moved through the preliminary questions with the brisk warmth of someone who genuinely liked this particular part of her job, unlike the custody disputes and the terminations that made up most of her docket. She reviewed the home study. She reviewed Deb Halloran's report, reading a section of it aloud that made my throat tighten, a line where Casey had told the caseworker, in her own 8-year-old words, "Marissa already does all the mom stuff. This is just so nobody can ever say she isn't, even on paper." The judge asked Wyatt and Casey, separately, in a small side room with just Deb present, whether they understood what was happening and whether they wanted it. I wasn't in the room for that part, by design, so their answers would be entirely their own, but Deb told me afterward what they'd said. Casey had answered first, without hesitation. "It means Marissa is really my mom, not just like my dad's wife. Real, on paper, so nobody can ever say I have to lose her." Wyatt, 13, and trying hard to seem unbothered by the whole thing, the way 13-year-olds try to seem unbothered by everything, had said only, "Yeah. She's basically already my mom. This just makes it real on paper, too, in case anything ever happens. I want that. I've wanted that for a while." Back in the courtroom, the judge turned to Grant and asked him to confirm his consent one final time, on the record. "I do," Grant said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, the way it hadn't cracked at that dinner table days before. "I should have made this easier for her a long time ago. She's been their mother since before either of us admitted it out loud." The judge signed the order. It took less than 90 seconds, the most consequential 90 seconds of my life, reduced to a signature and a stamp on a form that would be filed in a cabinet in a records office, and mostly forgotten by everyone except the four of us. "Congratulations, Miss Cole," Judge Aldwin said, closing the folder. "You're officially their mother, in every way the law recognizes, effective today." Casey cried, before the judge had even finished the sentence. Wyatt hugged me in a way he hadn't since he was 9 years old, too old now for easy hugs in front of strangers, but he gave me one anyway, right there in the courtroom, in front of the bailiff and the court reporter and, in the back row, his grandmother. Eleanor waited in the hallway afterward, by the elevators, alone. I almost walked past her. I'd earned the right, I thought, to just walk past her after everything, but she stepped slightly into my path, and something in her face stopped me. "I was wrong to say you don't belong," she said. It came out stiff, like each word cost her something significant to produce. I lost my daughter-in-law, and somewhere along the way I decided the only way to keep loving her was to keep you out, to keep this family's story exactly the way it was before the accident, as though freezing it in place could undo what happened. That wasn't fair to you, and watching Wyatt hug you back there, I realized it wasn't fair to them either. It was never fair to them. I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't. Not entirely, not yet. 6 years of small cuts don't heal in a courthouse hallway. "Thank you for saying that," I said instead, which was the most honest thing I could offer in that moment. "I'd like to try," she said, "being a grandmother who doesn't make things harder for once, if you'll let me." I looked at Wyatt and Casey, both of them still glowing from the courtroom, both of them watching this exchange with the careful attention kids give to adults who might, finally stop fighting over them. "They'd like that," I said. "So would I." It wasn't an instant fix. Eleanor and I spent the following months being careful with each other in a new way, cautious rather than combative, both of us learning what it looked like to actually be family instead of just occupying the same holiday table twice a year out of obligation. She asked, for the first time in 6 years, what Casey's favorite subject in school was, and didn't already know the answer, and admitted that she didn't. She started calling before Sunday dinners instead of simply expecting me to show up and cook, a small shift that meant more than it should have. There was an afternoon, about 6 weeks after the hearing, when Eleanor showed up at the house unannounced again, but this time with a box. Inside were things of Diana's she'd kept for years without telling anyone. A small jewelry box, a handful of photographs from before Wyatt was born, a journal Diana had kept during her first pregnancy. "I've been holding on to these," Eleanor said, standing in the doorway looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "I told myself I was saving them for the kids when they were older. I think I was really saving them, because giving them away felt like admitting she was gone for good. I'd like Wyatt and Casey to have them, and I'd like you to be the one who decides when they're ready, because you know them better than I do these days, and that's something I have to live with having let happen." I took the box. I didn't know what to say, so I just said thank you, and she nodded and left. And that was the moment I understood something had actually shifted, not just softened for appearances. Dean took longer, and honestly, some of the distance between us never fully closed. Some family fractures don't, and I've made peace with that in a way I couldn't have 6 years earlier. He never apologized directly, not in words, but even he showed up, unprompted, to Wyatt's 8th grade graduation the following spring, and sat 2 rows behind us, instead of skipping it the way he'd skipped Casey's first communion years before. Small things. I've learned to let small things count. Wyatt asked me, a few months after the adoption was finalized, sitting on the back porch one evening while Grant grilled dinner, whether I ever worried he and Casey would forget Diana now that the adoption made things official. "No," I told him. "Being your legal mother doesn't erase her. It just means nobody can ever question whether I'm allowed to keep loving you both, no matter what happens. Diana gave you life. I get to help you build the rest of it. Both things are true at the same time, and they don't cancel each other out." He nodded slowly, the way 13-year-olds nod when they're actually absorbing something instead of just waiting for the conversation to end, and went back to his phone. And that, more than anything, felt like the entire 11 months of paperwork and background checks and careful silence finally landing exactly where it needed to. Eleanor cried the loudest at that graduation, sitting next to me in the folding auditorium chairs, sharing a travel pack of tissues she'd apparently started carrying, just for occasions like this. Two women who'd spent 6 years at war over the exact same thing they'd both, it turned out, wanted all along, for those two kids to be loved enough and secured enough that nobody would ever again have to wonder at 2 a.m. or in a courtroom or anywhere else whether they truly belonged to someone who would never let them go. If you've ever had to fight to be recognized as family, not by blood, but by every single day you showed up anyway, every school play and broken arm and 2 a.m. fever, I hope this reminded you that the law can be slow, and families can be slower still, but love rarely waits for permission to be real. I'd love to hear your story in the comments if you've ever built a family the hard way, the true way. And if stories like this one matter to you, please consider subscribing so we can keep telling them.